Welcome back to That Change Show. I'm your host, Jason Little. It's an absolutely glorious day up here in the Great White North. It's Sunday, December 4th, 2022. Almost seems like a shame to ruin this beautiful day with such a polarizing topic, but here we are. So I get this question a lot in Lean Coffee sessions. This one happened last week, and people wanted to know in this session, what's the best Agile scaling framework out there? And I've had this question, like I said, a lot over the years. Agile scaling frameworks, I don't know, they seem to bring out the best and the worst in people all at the same time. So you can go all over LinkedIn and you can find people that love and hate frameworks. So it really depends on, which one you like the most. So maybe you're a fan of NEXUS, maybe you're a fan of large scale Scrum, or before that, Scrum of Scrums, disciplined Agile delivery, the Spotify model, maybe scaled Agile framework, or the scaled Agile framework that has pastel colors on it. But either way, they bring such a strong reaction from people. There's so many, this framework is not Agile, this framework is Agile. And just before I get rolling, again, if you are listening to this in your podcast listener thingy, you will miss out on some of the visuals I'm showing, so you can head over to our YouTube channel or leanchange.tv. You can find those links in the show notes, and you can see some of the visuals that I'm going through with this episode. So anyway, one of the reasons is, I've mentioned this book a couple of times, it's The New Kingmakers, and it basically says developers fall in love with the first language that they learn, and they compare everything to it. And that seems to be, it seems to be a universal truth for one, but it seems to be front and center for a lot of these scaling frameworks, because people tend to fall in love with the framework that they've already invented in their head, and they see a representation of it and they're like, yep, that's perfect, that's the greatest thing. And then people who think the opposite will look at a big scaling framework diagram and say, that is a bunch of garbage and nonsense, and that violates my beliefs about what the Agile values and principles are. So this, as you can see, it's a very, very thin, easy to read book, but if you want to have a little insight into why people are absolutely nuts and fall in love with the stuff they learn first, that's a really good book. So let's get rid of that. Maybe I'll scratch out the book thudding on the floor there, but maybe not. Anyway, so I think one thing that people forget about with respect to scaling frameworks is they're just a way to organize people. So I'm going to get into kind of looking, and I'm not going to go deep into any of these scaling frameworks, because more or less they're all derived from the same set of principles underneath. And I'll say a little bit more, maybe principles isn't the right word, but they're all derived from the same set of ideas for how they've been created. And they're just a manifestation of the creator's view of how things should work in organizations. You'll notice that many of them use the same organizing structures, but they give them cute names. I remember I did a talk at a conference, this was quite a while ago in Chicago, and this was when the Spotify model was all the rage. And I think I was working in one of the banks at the time, and it was funny how they brought that in. Somebody, the CIO, the CTO, somebody up at the top got a hold of the Spotify little whiteboard hand-drawn videos. So this bank, they had actually printed out the posters, and they sent the videos to everybody in the organization and said, we're going to go get one of those. And I remember when he presented the video on screen at one of these town halls, and the first question that they got asked was, so if we're going Agile, are we going to be allowed to wear jeans now? So you talk about a completely, the culture being so completely opposite from the intention of what that leader wanted to do. And nothing really happened. So I did an interesting little video about how organizations tend to latch onto these things because they look awesome and they look cute. And all they really do is they just rename their existing structures to whatever the name of this cute model is. And then they go, whammo, we've now transformed. And that's the skeptical part of it. And then there are other organizations that will actually go through the hard work of doing a reorg. So let's face it, moving to an Agile scaling framework is a reorganization. And it's very difficult to shoehorn Agile into existing structures. And some of the scaling frameworks we see, I think that's what people get upset about, is they'll look at, scaled Agile. Scaled Agile gets picked on the most. I've talked to people who have implemented scaled Agile, and the people liked it, the people didn't like it, the people hated it. people organizations who backslid on it, where they tried to implement it for a couple of years and it didn't work, and then they went back to a different way. So I'm not really pro or con any of them. I really could care less. That's a good one. I could care less. Large scale Scrum. Anyway, so when you really think about what people are missing with these scaling frameworks is there's so many different ways that you can organize people around getting work done. And one of the telecoms I did some work for mid-2000s or so, we were trying to implement Agile in one small group. So it was about 400 people in this. I can't remember what group it was. I'll just say it was in software development because they were responsible for a bunch of different things. So there was a team that was responsible for the public website. There was a team that was responsible for various API integrations to partners. The first team I worked with, we were responsible for like back office software for people who were doing phone activations and things like that. And from memory, I can't even remember how many stacks of teams were in that particular group. It was a mix of matrix structure and product teams. So for example, the team that was responsible for the public website, that was a team that remained static, more or less. So as contractors would come in and come out, the teams would change a little bit. And there were matrix teams that got spun up for certain projects. So they weren't completely product driven or matrix driven, and they weren't completely product driven either. But the structure that we used to actually shift towards Agile is we realized we were going to run into a bunch of problems. So, the team I was working with, we were a full stack team, and we were responsible for migrating a bunch of features and trying to make the activation process for people simpler. And we still had external QA that we had to deal with. So we had testers on our team. Some of the other teams didn't have testers. They were just development teams, and then they would hand over things to the testing team. So it was kind of a dog's breakfast of how people were organized. And there were instances where, because of the way that we were organized and the way that we were producing software, we would often break things in QA. And more often than not, the things that we quote unquote broke were because the tests that they were using were no longer valid because we might have removed a feature or we changed things so much that those tests weren't relevant anymore. And I remember I got in trouble from the QA manager for suggesting that, maybe in our project liftoff or sprint planning, we should bring in her or, one of her minions and then go through all the things that we were changing so they could figure out how to adjust their gate of their final QA. So that wasn't something that we could tackle at the time. Ideally, we'd be responsible for building, testing, and deploying the software ourselves, but in large organizations, that's often not the reality. And I got in trouble for basically saying that she was bad at her job. That was her interpretation, where mine was, I'm actually trying to save you a bunch of work because there's like 30 tests that are no longer valid anymore you should probably get rid of. So the way we had organized the structure at the time is we visualized and we modeled all of the different application teams and the supporting structure that we had underneath of it, because there were, there was a data group, there was a security group, there was, what else? There was a deploy group, a professional services / support group, external QA, a bunch of these other groups. And we had basically negotiated to have one person from each of those groups be sort of the lead for quote unquote Agile teams. So this was still in a mixed environment. There were some that were running Agile projects, take that for what you will, and some were still running more traditional serial-based projects. So we ended up having one person from each of those groups who was basically like not an escalation point, but like the HOV lane or the fast lane, basically. So if we needed to spin up a new machine, or if we needed to update a config file, or we needed to get something from production or whatever it was, we had a go-to person where we wouldn't get stuck in the sprint. So we were operating on 2-week sprints, and if something popped up, we had somebody we could go to even though they weren't part of our team. So we had built that structure, and that worked really well. I still remember the product owner who was dealing with the 20 or 30 different stakeholder groups on the business side. She was sort of the link to that section of the organization. She said it's the first time that we actually went live with no known defects. which I thought was really cool. But the other interesting thing was, because of the complexity of the environment in that 8-month project, we had at least 1.5, maybe 2 sprints where we didn't have any work because they couldn't feed the team work fast enough. So when we set up this structure, we set it up in a way that we were not coupled to the rest of the organization for the most part. I remember we would come in on, I think it was Wednesday mornings, we would deploy to production. So there was a production deployment team that we had to work with, and we had to create packages and hand it off to them. But we did that together with them. So we'd come in at 4 in the morning, and we would do the deployment to production, and then by like 7 o'clock, everything was done and ironed out. And we'd go out for breakfast and then go out for breakfast, and that was our retrospective. And then that was the end of the sprint, basically. So we did have the notion of release sprints, but it wasn't just like we had gotten to a predictable pace, let's just call it that. So we organized in a way has similar attributes to some of the scaling frameworks out there, but we organized in a way that made sense in the context. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people who are anti-scaling framework have a problem with, is much like any framework out there, I talk about this a lot in change management, is the more complex you make your models, the less you have to think. And I think, at least in the Agile space, people get upset about these scaling frameworks because they are a license to print money to a certain degree. So the certifications that they offer and the training behind it and the consulting services, they make a ton of money. And my view is good for them. So Dean Leffingwell created SAFE, I want to say in the late 2000s. I'll put that up on the screen because I can't remember the exact date, but it's been around for quite a while, and it's been hugely successful. And I say good for him, because that's what Agile advocates for. Figure out a product market fit, sell your products to a market, and grow it. That's the whole point of business. And I think people just get upset because it violates their values and principles, or it's taking Agile in the wrong direction. And my main point is, why would you care? Go live your life, go work in your own company, do whatever, or start your own company and do something different. So if I did have to pick, I guess, my favorite, just before I get into the next section here, I've always been more of a fan of disciplined Agile delivery, mostly because the stance from Scott and Mark, I think, is healthy. They kind of, well, first, Scott, I remember I was at one of the Agile conferences. He was on a panel doing a Q&A talking about certifications, and he said, "Congratulations, your check cleared, now you're certified." And I could not stop laughing, to the point where I actually had to get up and leave because people were looking at this idiot who's like sitting there laughing. But the stance that they take is, there's a whole pile of things that you can do to organize. Here's a starting spot in the middle. That's probably, pretty good for most companies. Take away and add, and adjust that based on your context. And, of course, now they're owned by PMI. I think that was late 2019. They were bought by PMI. And then, of course, the Boo Birds came out and started chastising them for kind of selling out. And again, my view is, good for you. You created a product that has value and has a market. That's kind of the whole point. And I don't think it strayed too much from what their view on the world was. But I do like that approach. Especially Disciplined Agile has this concept called enterprise awareness. And that is basically, when you're looking at Scrum teams or Agile teams, they tend to be carved off from the rest of the organization. And we forget that there's a greater organization around it. So you'll see a lot of conversations around, maybe we don't document anymore because we're Agile, or we're not going to do that PMO process anymore because we're Agile, and Agile doesn't do that. But we forget about the rest of the organization, and there's people in the organization that expect that stuff. So the concept of being enterprise aware is sort of know what you're kicking against, or know the current you're swimming against, so you can make a more well-formed decision. So in my brain, it's more pragmatic, as opposed to what comes across as being prescriptive. And I don't think any of these models are prescriptive. I don't think any of them say, here's exactly how you have to do it. I think they say, here's a suggestion and a starting guide for where you might want to go, and then you have to kind of sprinkle things around to make it work in your context. So let's get into what's underneath all of these things? Because when you look at them, you know, some call them teams, some call them tribes, some call them, geez, I'm gonna have to actually look this up because there's so many different names to all of these types of things. Some call them bases or value units or value streams or capability things. There's so many different names for the exact same things. Spotify, what do they call them? Guilds, tribes, chapters, those types of things. And like I mentioned with that video, the funny thing about the Spotify video that I did was, you know, we rename a functional department of developers to a developers guild, but we don't actually change anything about the actual structure. And that's really the main thing, is the structure. Sometimes when we talk about organizational structure or organizational design, we just talk about the boxes on the page. And there is very little talent needed to model something on a napkin in a bar and say, here's how we could organize people. Oh, that's the greatest model ever, let's go implement it. That's the teeniest piece. So organizational design's been around forever. Ever since humans have needed to trade products, the need to organize things has always been a human need. There's a really good book called The Organized Mind by Barry Levitin. And I always get his name wrong, but I'll put that up on the screen and in the show notes as well. And he talks about how, you know, back in the day, when we were cave people, we had to worry about two things I can eat and things that can eat me. And now when you go into the grocery store, there's 9,000 different types of cereals. So our brain has created technology, humanity has created technology so we can free our brains up for more complex thinking. We don't have to worry about these simple things anymore. And then as we evolved as humans and we started creating villages and we started creating products, like some would farm certain products, some would farm animals, and we would trade them. And then as we started trading these things, we needed to have an accounting system to organize things. We needed to have, you know, social agreements in place for how we dealt with trade. So we've always had this need to be more organized. And MIT's Managing Organizational Change course talks about this, the four main things for how organizations are structured. And the first thing they talk about is, how do we choose to group people together? And you could say that is the idea of guilds, bases, matrix teams, functional teams. There's a bunch of different ways that we'll group people in a container. Now, when we want those people to be able to work with other people and other groups of people, the next concept is linking. And how do we link those groups together? And we link them together with social contracts, you know, on the least organized end, and on the most organized end, we link them through official processes. So you must do these 5 things to hand off your thing from this group to this group. We link groups together through matrix structures, through ceremonies. And an example would be Scrum of Scrums, which dates back to the mid-90s, where we would have 2 Scrum teams and they needed to coordinate work between them. Scrum of Scrums was a ceremony where we could link and sync up, basically. Kanban, I've heard people call it a synchronization meeting. So there's ways that we link these groups together. And that leads to the third thing, which is alignment. How do we align those teams towards a common purpose? And some of the mechanisms there are program management. So we may have a program of multiple groups and multiple groups of groups. And programs are things that try to keep those things aligned with each other. But now we're starting to get out of the low-level org design and we're getting into the higher-level org design. So now alignment is more about, it could bring in HR elements. So how are different product groups, teams, individuals, how are they performance managed? Those all lead into alignment. So I worked in one organization where there were 2 teams. One was, this was in telecom, so this team was responsible for increasing prepaid activations, and this team was responsible for increasing postpaid. Those are completely at odds with each other, but that's how they're incentivized. So now you've got teams that are competing against each other. So whatever structure we've created for these teams to do work, that's the biggest barrier, is they're not aligned. They're not aligned because the organization has different objectives for the two that are completely in competition with each other. Now, it's obvious to say that should go away, but when you've got a stack of hierarchy of 500 people responsible for prepaid, what do you do with them? Well, merge them with postpaid. Okay, great. Now what about the existing structure that's already in postpaid? Now you've got 3 VPs or 5 VPs or 50 managers instead of 30 managers. What do you do with those extra people? And that's typically when we see these mass layoffs because we need to curtail redundancies in the HR area, as George Carlin would say. But alignment is really the third, and that's the more complex one, and that's when we start to creep into the higher level org design. The last step is basically, is it a fit? So how do we know if the way that we've chosen to organize people is an actual fit? And that's usually in performance management and business metrics, basically. So the high level and the low level org design principles is broken down into those 4 chunks. So again, the first one being, how do we choose to group people? Then how do we link those groups together? And then in the higher level, it is around how do we create alignment for it? And then how do we know it's a fit? So when we look at all these scaling frameworks, there's really just a pro and a con to how we choose to organize. One's not better than the other. But the funny thing is they all say that. It's a matter of your context, right? You could choose to organize this way, but there's going to be, you're moving the bottleneck around. If you choose to organize people in a functional way, developers, testers, ops people, production support or whatever, and you're bouncing, you're handing off things between those different groups, you're creating, a different set of problems. You're going to find problems in the software too late. You're more than likely not going to produce what the customer wants because the development team is so far away from the actual end customers. Then you say, well, we should create a value stream. So now instead of having the developers who are working on 5 products and then they hand those over to the testing team who hands it over to operations, we need to organize by value stream. So now we need to organize by this group is responsible for login and registration all the way through. So that we've got people from all those groups, from all those functional groups there. This one is responsible for, let's just say, the shopping cart or whatever it is. Shopify is known for organizing this way. So they've got, the music player, the music catalog, the licensing, the way that their tribes and things are structured. You could say is similar to Matrix, but then you just move the problem. So now, if you're organized by value stream, how do you maintain architecture and system integrity between the groups? So I worked in a healthcare organization where they were organized by application. They ended up having 3 gigantic JavaScript frameworks to maintain because each of the individual product groups were basically doing what they knew and what they thought was the best. And that created a nightmare in the back end for the overall platform. So then what happens? Well, we create a platform team to standardize it across. And then we move the bottleneck somewhere else. So we're not really organizing in an optimal way no matter what we do. We're just choosing what types of problems that we want to live with. When you think about how you want to scale Agile, if you want to call it that, or scaling organizations or doing organizational design, it's about the trade-offs that you're making for each of those 4 things. If we choose to group our people in a certain way, we're going to solve these problems, but we're going to create these ones. When we're talking about linking those groups together, then we're going to run into a different set of problems. So, like I said, if we're linking functional teams versus linking matrix teams together versus linking product teams together, there's pros and cons for each of those. Hopefully, we're going to be able to live with a set of problems that are a little bit more manageable. But when you think of these scaling frameworks, every organization I've worked in, I try to simplify that approach because many of them will look at a diagram and they will go, oh, I can see how I can shoehorn my organization into that, go train everybody on that, and get them certified, and then go implement it and just steamroller the organization with that change. And usually what I like to do is to back off the frameworks, the diagrams, and talk about how does work come into your system? Where does it come from? What do you do with it when it gets there? When you decide that whatever that piece of information is needs a product or a solution or a feature. What do you do with it then? And where does it go? And usually once people can story map that out, I actually did this in one organization, very small. So they had 5 teams, maybe 100 people in the organization. We did a story map on the wall, and I broke people into groups, and I had them do that. They actually stitched together a story of how things come to be and what they do with it. All 5 came up with the exact same model. And I was like, that's perfect. That's half the battle right there. You understand how work flows through your organization and how it changes and what happens when each of these groups are done with it. And I think that showed really strong alignment, which is the biggest part of the problem for me, because alignment is, if you're grouping people together, you can draw that on a piece of paper. If you're going to link them together or create processes, you can draw that stuff out and you have something that you can kind of look at and run scenarios through. Alignment is a lot more tricky because, like I said, that brings in performance management and HR and prioritization, and all of those things are what makes the soup really messy. So the example where I talked about the telecom, about how we chose to organize ourselves before scaling frameworks existed, the way we chose to deal with prioritization was by the 80-20 rule, or YAGNI, you ain't gonna need it. So if we had a feature that was coming down, and let's just say that was gonna require us to have to go to one of the mainframe teams to change something about the network or maybe a back-end billing system, we would have the conversation. Those teams were in very long serial life cycles, so they were 12 to 18 month release cycles. And basically it came down to, if we were able to weasel something through, great, if it was small enough. More often than not, we tried to deliver most of the feature that the product owner wanted without having to deal with those groups. So we chose to deal with our prioritization internally because we did have the conversation. Now, what happens if we do want to align other teams around this? Well, we've got to go up the stack and across and back down again. And then we have to look at budgets, and then we have to look at things like many enterprise organizations have processes for how the money gets spent, depending on the threshold of the dollar value. We really didn't want to step on any of those landmines, so we just said, you know what, we can do like 20% of this feature, and it's not going to do exactly that. It's kind of a workaround. And again, Agile people, when you hear workaround, they're like, no, you can't do workarounds. That's why software is so bad. That's the reality of software nowadays. You're always making trade-offs. So with that team, when they modeled that entire value chain, we started from the customer. And we found out that the people doing the work were 7 hops away from the customer. So the teams were aligned around how work comes in, what happens to it, what they do with it, how they organize themselves and synchronize between teams was flawless between all of them. Then that created the other problem of, the customer experience is not so great because we're too far removed from what the customer is doing. So what we did in that instance is, I don't remember I think they called it a SWAT team. So you've probably heard this term like digital factory and digital garage and SWAT team and innovation team and all these other groups of people that have direct contact with the customer, and they're running experiments on them. So we tried that. And what happened was this SWAT team was able to produce things so fast for the customers were like, oh, awesome, build that in the platform. Now we've got the 5 other teams that are already working on features for the core platform and other requests from customers and stuff. And now we've just moved the problem somewhere else. And I don't remember, what did we do to solve that? I think we created a process that there was like an unwritten social rule that the SWAT team would present themselves as an experiment team. So when they were doing those things with the customers, they would declare their intent that this is a beta, this is a prototype, this might not make it into the product, etc., etc. And then when they had to throw it over the wall, we would reprioritize things on the other end. So it just moved the problem somewhere else. And that's the main point of this podcast, is there's value in all of those scaling frameworks to a certain degree, but I don't think we should take them as seriously as they're taken. I mean, it's amazing to see how many wars there are about methods and frameworks out there. I remember when UNFIXED came out, and I can't find the article now, but I just remember the list of people who were saying, all you did was put pastel colors on safe. This is the same thing. And then, of course, Jürgen comes back with what the intent was and shows how it's different. And then Jürgen's fans come and attack those other people, and those other people attack right back. And this happens with safe all the time. And for me, I just grab the popcorn and, just watch hilarity ensue as people's personal beliefs get in the way of what the intention of some of these models are. So, what's the best scaling framework, just to close off this podcast? I think it's the wrong question to start with. I think if you really look at any of these scaling frameworks out there or any process model, if you dissect them and you look at them, you're going to find that it's just a series of trade-offs and it's consequences of action for how we've chosen to organize people, how we've chosen to link them together, what we're doing to align them towards a common purpose, and then putting a check in somewhere to see if it's a fit. So that's it for this episode of That Change Show. Remember to hit like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. And again, if you're listening to this in your podcast listener thingamajiggy, then make sure to go to thatchangeshow.com if you want to see the video versions and some of the visuals that I was showing through this. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of day, and I will see you on the next episode.